All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Josh Vickers with RTI International, and I will be your technical host for today. Today's webinar is titled Stable Isotope Forensics and Unidentified Persons Investigations. Your subject matter expert for today is Dr. Eric Bartelink. Dr. Eric Bartelink is a professor of physical anthropology and the director of the Human Identification Laboratory and the Stable Isotope Preparation Laboratory at California State University in Chico, California. He serves as the president of the American Board of Forensic Anthropology, as an instructor for California Peace Officers Standards and Training, or POST, and as a member of Team California for the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. His research focuses on the bioarchaeology of native California, forensic anthropology, and the use of stable isotopes to predict human diet and residence patterns based on chemical signatures in human remains. I'm going to go ahead and now switch everyone's layout to our presentation for today. And I'd like to go ahead and hand things over to Dr. Eric Bartelink.
Thank you, Josh. I wanted to thank Josh and his staff, as well as the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence and the National Institute of Justice for coordinating this webinar. So we'll go ahead and get started here. And so although my focus today is going to talk about using stable isotopes as a tool to try to help with identification of undocumented border crossers, I will talk about some of the general principles of stable isotope analysis. I'm going to keep some of the technical details at a minimum, just in the interest of time, and I can follow up with individuals by email if they have more specific questions. So to sort of get started, stable isotope analysis has been recently added to the repertoire of techniques that can provide investigative leads towards the identification of human remains. Stable isotopes measured in human tissues act as chemical tracers that record inputs from consumed foods, imbibed water, and pollutants in the environment. My work with stable isotope forensics has been a collaborative project, so I just wanted to mention many of the former students and some of my current colleagues that I'm working with on these issues. My training and background is in anthropology, and while I have taken courses in geochemistry, I feel most comfortable working closely with people who have greater expertise. So geochemists like Brett Tipple, who's currently at University of Utah, and Leslie Cheston, who is the president of Isoforensics, also in Utah. Also have a lot of collaborative projects with the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency through Greg Berg and his colleagues to try to use stable isotope forensics for helping to identify people from past wars and conflicts from the United States. Okay, so how can stable isotope analysis be used to help with unidentified persons cases? Well, one of the things we hope to do is to try to predict a birthplace of an individual, a region of origin, or a residence pattern of unidentified individuals. It's one of those things where it's not the first line of evidence in identification, it's one of the last. And when you have no leads through DNA or other methods of identification for missing persons cases, this is where isotopes can be very valuable. It's going to help you with narrowing search parameters where a person may have been, where they may have traveled from and to. And it also can be used to test hypotheses such as, is this set of remains an undocumented border crosser or a U.S. citizen, or are these sets of remains from Southeast Asia versus the United States? For the identification effort of unknown remains, stable isotope analysis can provide an important investigative tool. A person's tissues record information about inputs from water, food, air, through the transfer of elements into various tissues. The snapshot of time represented by different tissues can vary and provide a record of a person's dietary preferences, recent travel history, and place of childhood residence. They provide information on the individual's past through things such as tooth enamel, bones, and more recent past, things like body water, hair, and nails. The most common isotopes studied in human remains include isotopes of the bioelements of hydrogen and carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and sulfur, as well as trace elements of strontium and lead. Collectively, these isotopes can provide a powerful geolocation tool for provenancing human remains. Stable isotopes are atoms of an element that contain the same number of protons but a different number of neutrons, as shown in the example above for carbon. Thus, stable isotopes of the same element have different atomic weights due to the slight differences in mass, and travel at slightly different rates in chemical reactions. Unlike radioactive isotopes, these elements do not actively decay and thus are considered stable. Stable isotopes for a given element, such as carbon, are measured as the ratio of the heavy isotope to the light isotope, so carbon-13 to carbon-12, in human tissues, which are compared to ratios measured in international standards. Stable isotope ratios of bioelements are measured using stable isotope mass spectrometry and are reported in parts per 1,000 difference relative to the standard, also known as a per mil. Once converted to a per mil value, the delta symbol is used to report the value. So you'd say delta carbon-13 as an example. This ensures that measurements are all on the same scale and is used to transform these small ratios to larger values that are easier to work with. A more positive delta value indicates a sample has more of the rare isotope than the standard, while a more negative delta value indicates that the sample has less of the rare isotope than the standard. For geoelements such as strontium and lead, the raw ratios are typically used since values are often meaningful to several decimal places. Okay, in a sense, the way that we use stable isotopes is based on the principle of you are what you eat and what you drink. Our tissues reflect the isotopic composition of the foods and fluids that we consume, and we can study various tissues to get at different snapshots of time. For example, we can look at collagen in both bone and dentin. We can look at keratin in hair and fingernails. We can also look at minerals, for example, the carbonate structure in bone apatite or tooth enamel bioapatite. Recent applications of stable isotope analysis have focused on the analysis of isotopes of hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and sulfur, of the bioelements that I mentioned, as well as geoelements of strontium and lead. Those are going to be a little bit different than the light isotopes in the fact that they are incorporated into the mineral structure of bones and teeth as a substitution for calcium. By measuring isotope ratios in various tissues of the body that form over different intervals of the lifespan, for example, hair, nails, bones, and teeth, analysts can generate dietary profiles, can provide predictions regarding a person's region of origin, and can track a decedent's migration history. As an example for short-term records, we can look at things like fingernails, which grow at about 2 to 3 millimeters per month. Or we can look at things like hair, which grows at a rate of about 1 centimeter per month. This is going to provide a much more fine-grained record of the months and perhaps years of travel and diet history, depending on the length of the tissue. Stable isotopes in teeth record diet, drinking source, and geographic location at the time of tooth formation and remain unchanged during life, thus reflecting patterns of early childhood diet and residence. Teeth reflect the in utero period, starting with the formation of the deciduous dentition, all the way into adolescence when the final adult molars are forming. So they provide information about different points in the lifespan depending on the tooth type and when that tooth formed. Bone, in contrast, is continuously remodeled during life and thus represents an average of diet or migration history over the last several years of life. Thus, stable isotopes of bone will be more useful for identifying a traveler or a recent arrival who died in a foreign place. Bone may reflect the last 10 to 20 years of life depending on the skeletal element analyzed as well as the age of the individual. Ribs might turn over somewhere on the order of 5 to 8 years, where a femur could be closer to 20 years. And so if an individual is moving around a lot in the last decade or so of their life, that's going to average the different signals in that bulk value, and that will confound your analysis. Carbon isotopes act as dietary tracers in ecosystems and can be measured in hair, nails, bone, and dentinal collagen, as well as in bone and tooth bioappetite. Carbon isotope values vary in plants, as well as the animals that eat them, based on the specific photosynthetic pathway the plant evolved to use for metabolism. The majority of the Earth's vegetation, 95%, is classified as C3 plants, which include foodstuffs such as fruits, vegetables, beans, and grains. Less than 5% of plants are classified as C4, and these include cultigens such as corn, sugar, amaranth, millet, and sorghum. Due to differences in these photosynthetic pathways, C4 plants show significantly higher delta carbon 13 values than C3 plants, which are incorporated into the tissues of human consumers. Seafood, on the other hand, derives its carbon primarily from dissolved bicarbonate in the ocean and also results in elevated values that are similar to C4 resources. Thus, carbon isotopes can provide useful information regarding culturally or regionally specific dietary practices. Research has demonstrated that carbon molecules from dietary protein are preferentially routed to collagen, whereas the carbon isotopes and bioappetite are derived from the blood bicarbonate and more closely approximate the whole diet of an organism. So you can get different information by studying the collagen versus the appetite regarding diet. Okay, so simply, if you're eating a lot of corn products, you're going to have these sort of elevated carbon isotope values that are going to differentiate you from, say, an individual who's eating a lot of rice or other kinds of grains that are of the C3 variety. So distinguishing between Southeast Asians and U.S. Americans is fairly easy, and it's even easier to distinguish between Latin Americans and Southeast Asians due to the drastic differences in the relative consumption of C3 and C4 resources in those populations. Several recent studies have identified geographic variation in human diet through isotopic analysis of various tissues, especially hair and nails. The Isotope plot shown here by Husselman et al. 2015 indicates strong geographic patterning in stable carbon isotopes based on human hair and fingernails. In Mexico, Central and South America, high stable carbon isotope values reflect strong dietary inputs from C4 plants, such as corn products and meat from animals fed these products. The highest values within Latin America derive from northern regions of South America. These data suggest that dietary analysis can be useful in provenancing studies for unidentified human remains, including within Latin America. Stable nitrogen isotopes, in contrast, provide information on trophic level. Values in animal tissues are enriched by about 2 to 4 per mil over the main dietary protein source, as shown here. Tertiary consumers show the most elevated delta nitrogen 15 values, followed by secondary consumers, omnivores, and primary consumers. Thus, consumers of meat will have higher delta nitrogen 15 values than that of vegetarians and vegans. Stable oxygen and hydrogen isotopes reflect precipitation patterns. The lighter isotopes are retained in the atmosphere longer, while heavier isotopes condense to form rain, resulting in continental patterning. The farther away it rains from the ocean, the lighter the isotopes in the rain are, due to the rain-out effect of the heavier isotopes. These isotopes are compared to standard mean ocean water, also known as SMO, which is arbitrarily set to 0 per mil. Most of the oxygen atoms in our body come from the water we drink that is isotopically similar to the precipitation where we live. This can aid in geolocating an unidentified person. What is shown here is an Isotope map from Bartlink et al. 2014, a book chapter, and you can see just within the United States the strong geographic patterning with oxygen isotopes. Isotope maps are read as using different colors to represent different intervals of values, and so you can see up here in the Rockies, you're going to have some of the lowest oxygen and hydrogen isotope values that you're going to find in the U.S., whereas over here in a place like Texas, you're going to get the highest values. Okay, so this has been tested with tap water and hair in a number of studies, and have shown a strong correlation between the two. And The patterning between oxygen and hydrogen is very similar because since those two elements make up water, they show very, very strong correlation with one another, and they reflect global precipitation patterns, including things like temperature. Okay, finally, strontium isotopes reflect the geological age of the underlying bedrock in a region and are transferred into plants and the animals that consume them, including humans. Strontium substitutes for calcium in hydroxyapatite. And as strontium is leached out from geological bedrock, it becomes bioavailable to plants and animals. Okay, and strontium isotopes vary based on the age of the underlying geology. It is a decay product of rubidium, although it's considered stable, not a radioactive isotope, even though it's a product of radioactive decay. Lower strontium ratios are associated with younger rocks, and higher ratios are associated with older rocks. And you can see this geographic patterning here on this map with strontium isotopes. Okay, so let's get to some assumptions here, and these are very important with regards to how stable isotope analysis might be used in actual forensic cases. We do assume that human diet is patterned to a degree by ethnicity, region, etc., as reflected in carbon and nitrogen isotopes. And so we do expect that there's going to be some ethnic or regional patterning in diet, and we do see that in the carbon isotope that was put together, the carbon isoscape by Husselman et al. We also assume that most consumed food is consumed is locally grown, and this is going to be very important for strontium isotope ratios. If individuals are eating a lot of imported foods, that obviously is going to affect their strontium isotope ratios, and they're going to create a signature that does not reflect the local area. Is this a safe assumption? It may be, depending on the context. If you're talking about a rural village in Guatemala, it's likely that people are eating the majority of their foods from the local area, whereas a place like San Francisco, that's probably not as tenable of an assumption. So this is something that one of the limitations that we have to deal with, and has not been well tested to date, especially in places like the United States. We also assume that most imbibed water, so this water that you drink, that is consumed is local water. Most of the water that people drink does come out of the tap. Even if you're drinking bottled water, most bottled water is actually your local tap water that has been purified. And that's several studies have documented that. If you drink a lot of Fiji water, apparently that really is from Fiji, so that could be an issue. Again, you have to look at the context of where you're working and determine whether or not, and you have to determine if the tap water actually coincides with the precipitation water in that area. And we know like cities like San Francisco draw their tap water from other places in California and have oxygen isotope values that look very different from the local precipitation water. So there are many caveats with this. Some important things to recognize with respect to using stable isotopes. It's not going to tell you that a person is from Washington, D.C. It's not going to be that specific. It's not going to tell you that a person was an exclusive vegetarian except on holidays. It's kind of where I fall into the mix there. It's not going to tell you that a person traveled between New Jersey and Florida every summer. So it's going to be at a lower level of resolution than that. And obviously, if your hypothesis is the individual from Latin America or the U.S., that constrains your analysis and comparisons to those two general regions. Whereas if you ask the question, where in the world could this person be from, you're going to find that there's many different places that are going to have the same isotopic signatures. So it's really good to test specific hypotheses and to use this as an exclusionary tool to narrow down possibilities. For example, identifying whether a person is a local versus a non-local to the area is an important first step, and then trying to identify possible regions within the United States where a person may be from. That would also be a good application. And by region, It could be that you think that they're from the intermontane western U.S., or you think they're from the Gulf Coast, not really specific locations. So I'm going to do just a quick case study from California to illustrate, and this is one of the ones that we've done for one of our somewhat local sheriff coroner's offices. This case came in last year. Individual was found in a remote area in the Sierras. They had evidence of gunshot wound, and they were unidentified. The remains came to the CSU Chico Human Identification Lab. They were analyzed, determined to be those of a young male of Hispanic ancestry. We were asked to apply stable isotope analysis to this particular case. In doing so, we extracted tooth number 13, so the left first premolar, from the maxilla, and we sent that to isoforensics to do strontium and oxygen isotope analysis. I'm only going to present on the tooth data here, but our lab did process the bone sample and found relatively similar results. Okay, so on the bottom left, you can see an isoscape map, and the way that isoforensics, they use basically GIS software. They plot all the places where these isotopic values could occur, assuming that the person is from the United States. And that's an important assumption to sort of start with. You can see all the areas that are in dark gray reflect all the places where the oxygen isotope value could be drawn from. And so you can see a strip along the west coast and the southwest, cutting through the middle of the country, going up towards as far north as Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The areas that are in light gray, not the lightest gray, but the next lightest gray, reflect all the areas where that strontium value could have derived from. And the areas in red show where the oxygen and strontium overlap. And that's going to be the most, assuming that those two are both tracking water and food for this individual, that's going to be your best bet in terms of possible locations where they could be from. There was an area in red that was not in Tulare County, but it was in the adjacent county to the south called to the north called Fresno County, and that's the area with the blue arrow and the blue dot. That ended up being where the individual was from. They were positively identified. They were a reported missing person, and the isoscape map was at least consistent with that location where they were known to be from, and that was the closest location to where the remains were found. You can see there's a lot of other places in red, and we just cannot exclude those. Again, we're trying to narrow down the number of haystacks to look through, and in this case, it was useful in associating the remains to the place of origin. And now I'm going to switch gears here and talk about a much bigger project, and this is going to have to do with the great tragedy on the southern border here. I'm going to focus specifically on border crosser deaths in South Texas, recognizing that this is an issue all the way across the border, particularly in Pima County and Tucson, with where Bruce Anderson and his group are doing great work. And then not as much recently, but certainly in the past, Southern California as well. Those are two areas where I hope to do additional research in the future to help with identification efforts. Okay, so to switch over to South Texas, what you're seeing on this map here is each red dot represents a death in Falfurrias, which is a town in the county. It's in Brooks County in Texas, one of the poorest counties in the state, primarily ranch land, and it's an area where individuals are trying to cross. They're about 80 miles into Texas already, but they're just trying to bypass a border checkpoint. And you can see that labeled on the map here. To avoid this border checkpoint, individuals are trying to walk through private land strand to get around it, and they're dying of heat stroke, exposure, dehydration, et cetera, pretty much getting lost on the landscape and are often not found for many weeks or months, sometimes years after death. So recently implemented U.S. border policies have resulted in a dramatic increase in undocumented border crosser deaths, especially along the Arizona-Mexico and Texas-Mexico border. Since 1999, there have been more than 6,000 migrant deaths along the border, representing Mexican, Central American, and South American nationals. The large volume of UBC casework has created an unprecedented human identification challenge, especially given the lack of personal documentation, antemortem records, and DNA family reference samples for these individuals. Forensic anthropologists have featured prominently in the identification process, as most deceased individuals are not located for several weeks to months after death. The majority of migrant deaths over the last decade have occurred along the Arizona-Mexico border, specifically in the Tucson sector. This has led to the implementation of increased border security measures in the region. Rather than deterring migrant crossings, it has resulted in a dramatic increase in migrant deaths in South Texas since 2010. For example, between 2011 and 2012, Texas has experienced a 70% increase in migrant deaths. In 2013, Dr. Krista Latham of the University of Indianapolis and Dr. Lori Baker of Baylor University began a large-scale effort to exhume and identify deceased border crossers buried in Falfurrias, Texas. This area within Brooks County, located approximately 80 miles from the Texas-Mexico border, is along a major migration route for UBCs. However, in order to avoid immigration checkpoints, many migrants walk several miles off track and perish from the long-term effects of sun exposure and dehydration. Over the past several years, deceased border crossers have been buried at Sacred Heart Cemetery in Falfurrias with very little effort made towards identification and repatriation. I believe there are teams that are out there right now conducting another excavation as we speak. Collaborative work between the University of Indianapolis, Baylor University, and Texas State University San Marcos has resulted in a concerted effort to identify these deceased migrants and to repatriate them to family members. The migrant remains are currently held at Texas State University for skeletal processing, DNA and isotope sampling, and temporary curation. Part of this effort further includes collaboration with the Argentine Forensic Anthropology Team, the EAAF, who are assisting with family reference sample DNA collection, as well as the University of North Texas and Bodie, who have processed and compared DNA profiles for matches. This map shows the most common train routes migrants follow to get close to the U.S. border. Border Patrol apprehension statistics demonstrate stark differences between the nationalities of UBCs who cross the border through the Tucson sector versus those who cross the border through southern Texas. The majority of UBCs apprehended in the Tucson sector are of Mexican nationality, whereas UBCs apprehended in southern Texas are most commonly of Central or South American nationality. Although only a few individuals recovered from Sacred Heart Cemetery in Texas are identified, the profiles of those who have been identified, as well as craniometric data conducted by Kate Spradley and her team, indicate that deceased UBCs are primarily from Central and South America. Although Isotope maps based on both precipitation and tap water are well developed for the United States, Isotope maps have much poorer resolution for Latin America. Most of the available data are from precipitation water samples, which show poorer resolution than tap water samples. In addition, detailed strontium isotope maps do not yet exist for Latin America. The available data largely derive from archaeological isotope studies or geological research. I just came across this paper recently by Laffoon et al., which actually created the first isotope I've ever seen for that includes parts of Latin America. And not very good resolution, but you can definitely see with the oxygen isotopes, if you just look at a place like the Yucatan Peninsula here, you can see that there's not a lot of isotopic variation, and part of that has to do with how narrow that landmass is in that area. You don't get a lot of fractionation of oxygen or hydrogen. Strontium does show a lot more variation, as you can see here, but again, it's still not that well mapped out yet. So this is a good, important first step, I think, to start building an isotope. And there are some individuals that are trying to work on this based on published bioarchaeological data. Okay, some comparative reference data that I have is shown here, and this data is from, part of it's from a publication from 2014, and others are ongoing work collaborating with DPAA and Greg Berg, as well as isoforensics. But this basically shows carbon and nitrogen isotope data, it shows carbon isotope data for 42 UBC samples from Sacred Heart Cemetery in Falfurrias. Includes 12 individuals analyzed by the University of Indianapolis, as well as 30 individuals submitted to the DPAA by Baylor University. In addition, I have data on 30 other individuals that I'm currently working on to add to this data set. So you can actually see here the very, very high carbon isotope values in the UBC sample here. Let's compare the UBCs, that sample of 42, to USA. Okay, this is a sample from DPAA, so it is not meant to be taken as a representative sample of the U.S. population, but it does show you very stark differences in the carbon isotope values. So these are 95% confidence intervals for these samples, and you can see the UBCs have the most C4 resources in their diet, followed by the U.S. This is a group from Northeast Asia, so basically from Korea, and this is finally Southeast Asia. So it's sort of a gradient from C4 to C3 resources. It does show strong isotopic patterning by region in carbon isotopes. And this could be very useful for identification purposes, especially as an initial screening tool, as one of the case studies will show here in a minute. Just doing a discriminant function analysis between the UBC samples and the USA samples, while there are 3 outliers shown here, here, and here, you can see there's not much overlap in the distributions, and discriminant function analysis actually correctly classified UBC versus US American 96.2% of the time using leave one out discriminant function analysis. Okay, 3 brief case studies are used to illustrate how oxygen isotopes can be used to generate isoscape maps based on enamel bioapatite. These maps were created by isoforensics. The isoscape map shown here is of skeletal remains of a 30 to 50-year-old female who was recovered in Falfurrias in 2013. The main limitation as seen here is that multiple regions are predicted throughout Mexico and Central America. So the oxygen isotope values for water where this tooth value could have derived from are in many different places, and including the United States. This individual was positively identified as a Guatemalan national through DNA testing, and we can see that the isoscape includes her now known region of origin. Okay, and just because we have strontium data, even though we didn't have any kind of isoscape map to use at the time, just comparing her strontium isotope value over here, this 7.70795, it seems to be most consistent with published bioarchaeological research of the northern and southern lowlands, the Maya area here. And that's consistent with where she was from. Of course, this is confirmation bias, so we have to be kind of careful here. I'm doing this after the fact. She was identified, and then I'm comparing her strontium value to the known place of origin. Just kind of shows you that if we try to isoscape her or place her value on the landscape, this is where she's known to be from. This sort of area in green is most consistent with her value. There are many other places that are consistent with that same region of origin, and so it's going to take a little bit of work to really fine-tune this to actually use it as a predictive tool here for many of these cases. This is a case that was very interesting, this case 2. Oxygen isoscape map of skeletal remains of a 30 to 55-year-old male recovered in Falfurrias, Texas in 2011. He is still unidentified, but the isoscape map suggests that he's not likely from North America, not likely from Mexico, or even Central America. The oxygen isotope values predict a more likely South American origin, and this would include areas of Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, French Guiana, and Brazil. In this case, auction isotopes can provide more specific information for geolocation than what has been provided by many of the other UBC cases. So it'll be interesting to see in the larger data set that I have how many other individuals are consistent with the South American origin. Okay, the third and final case is that of an unidentified Hispanic female, at least 45 years of age, who was found in Falfurrias in 2013. This case is of particular note because the auction isotope prediction excludes Latin America but includes the United States. So when you see a case like this, you wonder, was this an individual who died in Brooks County, was assumed to be a border crosser but was not, was in fact a U.S. citizen? That's certainly a possibility. This is where looking at some of the other isotopes were really useful. And what I have plotted over here on the right side, these individuals in blue are all the UBC samples that I have carbon isotope data from the bone collagen, whereas the ones in red are the DPAA USA American samples. The arrow, the blue arrow, points specifically to this individual. So this female that had an auction isotope value more consistent with the United States. She also has a diet that's more consistent with U.S. Americans. So it's possible that she is not a border crosser. Talking with Krista Latham, she suggested this individual may have been an individual who was undocumented but grew up in the United States, may have been deported, and then died trying to cross again back to the United States. That's certainly a possibility. And of course, you want to think about all options here, but I'll be very excited if this case gets identified, so I'd have a little bit more history on the context. This slide shows a bivariate plot of auction and strontium isotopes for a subsample of 10 of the individuals and suggests at least a moderate level of heterogeneity in region of origin, especially for strontium. Strontium isotope data generally overlap with areas of the Yucatan Peninsula that have been examined by bioarchaeologists, although other regions within Mexico and South America cannot be ruled out. With the larger data set, I should be able to add another 30 individuals to this and have a better sense of the patterning. So this is still extremely preliminary. And with the further development of an isoscape map for Latin America, that will help tremendously. Okay, so I'm going to get to the limitations and challenges here. I'm just about ready to wrap up. Stable isotope analysis can provide a useful investigative tool to aid in the identification effort of UBCs, undocumented border crossers. We recognize that the development of a global supermarket economy and increased use of bottled water may hinder our efforts to a degree for using stable isotopes as a geolocation tool. So we encourage people to eat and drink locally. That will really help us out. The addition of strontium isotope baseline maps and collection of tap water samples from throughout Latin America should also aid in narrowing down a more specific region of origin for future cases. You can use features like IsoMap, which is through waterisotopes.org. You can actually do your own isoscape maps, and it's a giant data share. However, the resolution tends to be much lower for using precipitation water versus tap water. And places like Isoforensics do have maps based on tap water, but the data for Latin America is very limited, and it's also proprietary data that they own as a private company. I often give glass vials to individuals who are going to Latin America to see if they can collect water samples to add to that tap water database, which is very important. Ongoing efforts will work towards creating better baseline strontium isoscape maps for Latin America, generated from geological maps and other sets of archaeological and bioarchaeological data, which can be tested against reference sample data. And there's also some evidence of significant variation in results between stable isotope laboratories, and prior testing and standardization of laboratories important to the reporting of accurate results. This is a a figure from Pestle et al. 2014 in PLOS 1, and it shows each grouping here is a laboratory, and so 20 laboratories participated in the study, and they were given 5 pieces of bone and told to prepare each piece, split each of the 5 pieces into halves, prep one for carbon and oxygen isotopes for bioapatite, and then the other half for carbon and nitrogen isotopes for the bone collagen. And what this one is showing you is the most abysmal results, which are the oxygen isotope data. All of these values derive from the same femur. So 20 labs received 5 fragments of the same femur, and you can see differences as great as 7 per mil between on the extreme ends of the distribution here. This suggests that oxygen isotopes are the values that we're receiving are influenced by prep methods that seem to account for about 50% of the variance, and the other 50% seem to be explained by mass spectrometry and analysis procedures. When all the samples were run in one lab, it took the amount of variance in half. So this is something that's very real, it's very problematic, and if you're using multiple different laboratories, you may end up with values that are not comparable. This is not something that we like to see, and there are many researchers trying to solve some of these issues here. I recommend using the same laboratory for all your samples if possible to at least reduce that variation. Okay, so just some brief conclusions. Large geographic regions can be differentiated based on dietary isotope values. The addition of strontium and oxygen isoscapes will help to further narrow search parameters. And case studies from Furious, Texas illustrate how stable isotope analysis can be used as an effective geolocation tool for identifying border crossers as well as other unidentified individuals. So with that, I'd like to thank the AAFS Humanitarian and Human Rights Resource Center, who provided much of the funding for this research. I'd like to thank Dr. Tim Gaucher, Dr. Kate Spradley from Texas State University, Dr. Lori Baker from Baylor University, Dr. Tom Holland and John Bird from DPAA, Mr. Vincent Sava, Ms. Audrey Meehan, Ms. Nikki Willits for their assistance with many of the samples, and then Dr. Joy Matthews from UC Davis Stable Isotope Facility, and Mike Lott and Leslie Chesson from IsoForensics, and Brett Tipple from University of Utah for their assistance with data analysis and data interpretation. All right, that is the end of my presentation.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much, Eric. We're going to go ahead and switch everyone's layout now to our Q&A session. We did have quite a few questions that came in, so we'll just go ahead and jump right into it. Our first question was towards the beginning of your presentation from Aaron Brudnell. He asked, when sorting out the assumptions related to consuming local food, is it reasonable to presume agreement of multiple types of ratios in agreement to the independent variables corroborating each other?
I think it's something that needs to be looked at, and so certainly if you're going to use one isotope as a screening tool, in this case, I've often used carbon, which seems strange because carbon reflects diet, but if you have such dramatic differences in diet, such as the amount of corn consumed in most parts of Latin America versus the United States, I think it's a good place to start if that's your identification hypothesis. Obviously, the more isotopes that seem to line up towards your expectations, I think that does provide better strength of an argument. And but we always have to sort of default to that this is an investigative tool. It's designed to try to provide investigative leads. It's rarely going to directly lead to an identification in most cases. I hope I understood that question correctly.
All right. Next question we have is from Nancy Burke-Bradley. She's asking, what are bottled water types that can be trusted besides Fiji water as to where their actual location is coming from?
That is a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. I know that Leslie Chesson from IsoForensics has published papers on this, and I don't know that she's named the specific companies due to not wanting to out a company for false advertising or something like that. I don't know the answer to that, but I know that she and others have done some fairly extensive testing, and they found that much of the bottled water that you would buy at your local grocery store looks very similar to the local tap water that you drink. And so we're kind of getting ripped off by being sold our own tap water back to us, slightly purified.
All right, that's great information to know. Next question is in regards to slide 21 or 22. Are there any validated studies that have been conducted to verify this work? What approach was used to validate these studies?
So in this particular case, this is an area that's been understudied by forensic scientists, and so there's been a fair amount of validation on animals, on plants, and certainly on humans in modern archaeological contexts from places like North America. But as you get into Latin America, the majority of the work has been done by archaeologists and bioarchaeologists, and so they have measured isotopic values in ancient skeletons, and using that as a baseline for modern skeletons is somewhat problematic, but it is a place to start. And with this recent publication of the article by Laffoon et al., which is in PLOS One, that followed a similar approach to creating the isoscape maps that we see for North America, and it is a first step. So I'd say that it's been validated on some levels, and the assumption is that it should work similar regardless of which area that you're working. Some areas are going to have more isotopic variation than others in, let's say, rainfall patterns or in geology, and so some areas are going to be much more, the method will work better in some areas than others. But we're still at a very preliminary phase here, and ideally you'd want to start with known samples of origin, use that to help build your baseline reference data, and then apply it to the UBC samples. The problem is that it's very difficult to get modern samples from those areas and to sort of use that to establish the baseline data. So we're kind of putting the cart in front of the horse a little bit on this to some degree, and are trying to kind of cobble this together the best we can.
All right. Next question we have is in regards to slide 29. It's from Shanice, and she's asking, is there any work being done outside of the Americas with stable isotopes?
Yes, and I'd say that pretty much anywhere in the world there are people doing, the majority of stable isotopes is geochemist, isotope ecologist, hydrologist, people studying climate change, and so that's occurring everywhere, everywhere where there's something interesting to study. Anthropologists are working in many different areas of the world. Obviously, there's some areas that are understudied. There has not been that much stable isotope work done in Africa, and certainly that might reflect problems with working in certain countries in Africa, access to resources and materials, and also interest. So some areas have been studied much better than others. Fortunately for us, the geochemists, the isotope ecologists, the hydrologists are interested in studying things like strontium, oxygen, hydrogen, isotope variation. And we're piggybacking on, in many cases, their work because they have other questions that they're trying to answer, and they just happen to be able to provide useful information for us to use for our purposes.
Okay. Next question we have is in regards to slide 35. Once you get an area or areas where the individual may be from, what are your next steps to narrow it down and positively identify them?
So ideally and again, I haven't been working on this project for that long, and I have just recently got a lot of results that I need to work through and conduct the data analysis. But one thing that I will say is that I will share this information with Texas State and all the different NGOs and organizations that they're working with. And what I hope is that there's possibly personal effects that might point to a region of origin that can be coupled with things like craniometric data, perhaps information about dental work that may reflect a certain region within Latin America, and then having the isotope data kind of on top of that. And so I see it as a one component of the broader picture of an identification, and the hope is that it will help and not hinder those identification efforts. And then when individuals are positively identified, we can determine whether or not the isotopic data, corresponded to their known region of origin.
All right. Next question we have, we've got a couple of good questions coming up. What collection techniques are being used to collect samples from UBCs?
That's a great question. So the samples were not being collected initially from these individuals that were buried in Falfurrias at the Sacred Heart Cemetery. It was only the involvement of the anthropologist in bringing greater awareness to law enforcement that they needed to be doing this. And so these exhumations and bringing the remains to Texas State has been a really important component of this. And so they've been able to take samples for DNA at Texas State. They do go to University of North Texas, sort of following state law, but there's been a problem with getting the family reference samples into the CODIS database because most of the individuals, the family reference samples would be from somewhere in Latin America, or perhaps from individuals who live in the United States undocumented, and they may be afraid to come forward to provide those samples. And so this is where the Argentine forensics team has been very helpful. They've aided in collecting family reference samples from Latin American countries, and I believe have submitted those to Bodie, I think it's called Bodie Cellmark now, for comparison with the human remains DNA. So 2 samples of human remains DNA are being taken, one that goes to North Texas but is difficult to compare with a family reference sample, and another one is going to Bodie Technology, or Bodie Cellmark, to compare with the family reference sample. So this is a highly unusual way to go about identifying individuals, but it seems to be the most way to get around all the bureaucracy that we have with trying to get the family reference samples.
All right. Before I ask the next question, I just want to thank the audience for all of the chatter back and forth. That's one of the things that we pride ourselves here at the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence, is not only bringing you information, but also connecting people. So it's a great conversation going on there in the chat pod. Next question we have is from Patrice Hall. It's a 3-parter, and we've actually had a few people ask this question. How many unknown cases have been solved using isotopes? How much does it cost, and what is the turnaround time?
Those are 3 good questions. I can't tell you the number of cases. I wouldn't say that stable isotope analysis has solved many cases, but I would say that it has provided investigative leads. I know of maybe a dozen or so that have been published in the literature where it did help. Obviously, we're doing these a lot on unknown cases, so they may remain unknown for a long period of time, and so we may not get our answer for some period of time to sort of validate that. With the UBC application, and also the application to things like DPAA, when they have remains, they don't know if they're U.S. soldiers or individuals from Southeast Asia. Every time you're able to differentiate those, you have at least provided another line of evidence to say, okay, this person is probably a U.S. American versus a UBC, or this person is probably a Southeast Asian individual, a local indigenous person versus a U.S. soldier. So it sort of depends, I guess, how you define success. One of the most interesting applications of isotopes in forensics was when it was used to try to identify which laboratory generated the anthrax from the anthrax scare that happened after September 11th. And so that was an application where it was very useful, to try to locate which laboratory was most likely involved with that particular incident. The second question was that about the turnaround time?
Second question was about cost, and then the third was about turnaround time.
Okay, cost can vary, and so the laboratory we use for our bone collagen, it's only $8.50 to run the samples. Labs that do the bone or tooth appetite usually charge somewhere around $20 to $40 per sample. We run all our appetite samples through isoforensics, and it does cost $126 per sample, I believe, for that, $100 for an Isotope map. Strontium can cost a lot. It's around a little over $300, I believe, with isoforensics, or maybe it's, don't quote me on it, somewhere $250 to $350. I'm forgetting the exact number. So it is very expensive, and it has to do with the cost of the mass spec that they use to analyze it. Other laboratories might charge as little as $100, but maybe as much as $300 or $400 per sample. So strontium can be very expensive. If you are associated with a university that has this in-house, then it obviously can defray the cost pretty significantly. What really costs a lot is the prep, and so the prep is labor, and having somebody prepare samples can take a long time, especially if they're doing collagen. Collagen can take a few weeks, depending. If you dissolve a chunk of bone, it can take 3 to 4 weeks to process samples. We do much of our forensic work, or pretty much all of it to date, has been pro bono, so we have not charged for the prep or the chemicals or supplies, and we have only charged, obviously, for the cost of the mass spec fees and the analysis, the isoscape maps, et cetera. And the turnaround time could depend. Usually it's one of my students that are preparing samples, but they're going to be working on it for about 2 or 3 months for a batch of, let's say, 24 samples. And so I would say probably a good 6-month turnaround time would be very safe in terms of getting all the samples prepared, analyzed, waiting for the lab to run them, which can take several weeks depending on how backed up they are, and then to produce some kind of report. So 6 months would be pretty reasonable for at least what I could offer as a service to a law enforcement agency. Labs can, if the samples are prepped and ready to run, it just matters how backlogged they are, and so some labs can do them within a few days to a few weeks, and other labs are backed up for sometimes a couple months.
All right. In the interest of time, we are going to take 2 more questions. For those of you that did not have your questions answered, we have put Eric Bartolink's email address down there at the very bottom of your screen. He has agreed to let us contact him directly with any follow-up questions, so please go ahead and take that down. That way you can ask him directly if we do not get your question answered. The next question we have is in regards to Case 3. Case 3 is very interesting. What time frame does the isotope analysis cover? And if Case 3 had no mapping south of the border, how likely is it that she was born outside of the United States?
So for that particular case, I believe we sampled a molar tooth. I don't remember offhand which one it was, but if it's the first molar tooth, it would be reflecting the in utero, or actually probably right around birth through the first few years of life. So it depends on which molar tooth we sampled. I don't remember off the top of my head. I'd have to look, but it would be basically looking at a snapshot of childhood of location. We found, I think, similar results in her bone value as well, and suggesting there was no major change or movement probably between childhood and adulthood. And so I think it's highly unlikely that she was born and raised somewhere south of the border. It just seems very inconsistent with that. And then looking at the carbon and nitrogen isotopes suggests that she's more similar to U.S. Americans than to a UBC. So that one is very perplexing, and it could just be that she was a Hispanic female who happened to die for other reasons and was not crossing the border. But ultimately, we have to wait for verification, when this person's identified to actually know, and hopefully we'll have more information on that.
All right, and our last question for the day before we have to close up is in regards to your case studies. When a body is found on the trail, does it generally signify that persons were traveling together or separately? And what is the average distance that you found between locations? Are we talking miles, yards, as far as the remains that you were recovering in your cases?
So for these cases, I was not involved with the actual recovery. They were largely done by law enforcement, and unfortunately they did not often record the specific location where remains were found. I think there's a tendency for when there is a crossing, and in this case people are already 80 miles in, they're being dropped off by the coyotes or whoever they've hired to help them with their passage, and they are often traveling as a group, and if an individual is unable to keep up due to health issues or if they're feeling ill, they often are left behind. And so I think what we're often seeing is individuals who are just left behind basically because they couldn't keep up with the group. I know in one instance there was a rancher who found over 20 different sets of remains on his ranch property over the years. It might have been like 28 or something like that. So it does suggest that there's some clustering of certain areas where people are trying to pass, where they can get through these ranch properties. That map I showed kind of showed you the locations where bodies were recovered, like approximate locations. But unfortunately, they haven't done a very good job, especially in their early years, of really documenting the locations too specifically.
All right. Unfortunately, with that, we are going to have to go ahead and close up our webinar for today. First thing we'd like to do is obviously thank Dr. Bartlink for giving us his presentation and disseminating his research out to our group. Thank you so much, Doctor. We really appreciate your time and your presentation today.
Thank you, and thanks to all the participants. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have by email or correct anything I said if it was inaccurate. Be happy to provide literature to people as well if they want more information about applications of forensic isotopes for casework.
All right. Thank you so much again, Dr. Bartlink. And as he mentioned, thank you so much to all of our participants. We definitely could not have these webinars without your attendance and your feedback and your all of your questions that you had for us today. So thank you very much for attending. We really appreciate it. You will see there on your screen, we do have our customer satisfaction survey. If you just click the word here, it will bring up a link on your screen that will take you to our survey. We value everyone's feedback. We really take the customer satisfaction survey seriously. It helps us not only with the content that we bring, but also how we deliver all of the content out to you. So we definitely appreciate that. We're saying that the link might not work, so we will make sure to get that out to you shortly as well. We did speak with Dr. Bartlink. He has agreed to let us disseminate all of the slides for today as a PDF version. So we will be sending out all of the slides to our attendees today. So again, you will see those hopefully by completion of business today coming into your inbox. That is all that we have for today. I am also going to go ahead and pop up a link on everyone's screen to our new website. Definitely check out our website for all of our free trainings that we are offering, all of our free webinars, and just reading some of the comments below. Yes, we will definitely post the link up in the chat pod here shortly for the survey. And again, I apologize for that link being broken. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Barnelink, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today, and we hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you.